Yeah? Yeah, he's not gonna like that. Well, he kind of did it to himself, but... Panzer Dragoon. Yeah, this definitely has a virus or something. Sometimes you just stumble upon something randomly that ends up making a way bigger impact on you than you expected. And that's what happened to me with Panzer Dragoon. I'm typically not one to play older games. I mean, the first Panzer Dragoon was released before I was born by a platform holder who stopped making consoles at the turn of the century. And aside from one remake, so far, the series has seen almost nothing in terms of ports, remasters, or any way to be played conveniently by a modern audience. But let me tell you, from the moment I finally got the first game running and I played the first level, I knew that Team Andromeda, the game's developer, had made something special. So I played through the game, and when I finished, I moved right along to the next one, and the next. Even when actually getting the game to launch and play properly took ages, I pushed through, because I was genuinely excited to play more. And given the lack of ways to play this series and how it's slipped slowly into semi-obscurity, I wanted to make a video talking about it, because it is absolutely worth talking about. I won't go too much into the details of the series' development and how its relationship with Sega affected its lifespan. This video will be focused more on the games themselves, starting naturally with 1995's Panzer Dragoon. One thing I will say about the development is that Team Andromeda spent months developing concept art and world elements before even receiving development kits to begin production on the game. And this is something that quickly becomes apparent as the very first thing that you see when booting up the game, before even getting to the main menu, is nearly 7 minutes of cutscenes. The animations are fairly stiff and the visual fidelity of the pre-rendered scenes is very low by today's standards, but even so, they do a pretty good job of establishing the world and the motivation for our protagonist and his new dragon companion, at least by 1995 video game standards. You then launch straight into the meat and potatoes of the game, which is a fantasy rail shooter with a dragon mount. The game offers almost nothing in the way of tutorials and basically leaves you to press buttons and figure it out. Thankfully, it's fairly simple. You get a button that fires your rider's gun, and if you hold the button, you can target enemies and have the dragon fire lasers instead. Moving your reticle far enough will allow you to maneuver your dragon around as long as you're facing forward, because the shoulder buttons will turn your camera 90 degrees, meaning you can look and fire in any direction. You can also bring the camera in closer for more precise shots, but that's really the extent of the game's controls. Point, shoot, move around. It's a simple game, but it's incredibly engaging. Every element from the gameplay to the music to the environment design to the enemy placement, everything is masterfully executed to draw you into this world and keep you playing until the credits roll. And it's a good thing too, because this game is tough as nails. There are plenty of enemies and obstacles that can damage you, and there is no way to replenish your health other than completing a level, and even then, it only restores about half of it. But more importantly, the game has no saves or checkpoints, and limited continues. You can get more continue credits if you shoot down more enemies, but even so, it's unlikely you'll finish the game before you run out of continues on your first try. The game itself is fairly short, and if you play through without dying, you can get through it in about an hour. But the game is built on replay. Like I said, you probably won't beat it on your first try, so you'll end up replaying stages many times, learning their patterns and layouts. You'll get better at the game and earn more credits, and eventually you'll get good enough to beat the final boss, who's a real doozy. I have to say I was thankful for emulators at the end of this game, and particularly save states, because dying to this guy right at the end of the game and having to start all the way back at the beginning to repeat the process didn't sound entirely appealing. That aside, the gameplay overall is just fantastic. The pacing throughout the levels is great, and even the game's difficulty works in its favor. I lost count of the number of times I was playing this game and thought, oh shit, what's gonna happen now? While I gripped my controller in gleeful anticipation of what the game would throw at me and how I'd have to overcome it. There's just such a strong sense of adrenaline playing through every stage. It's exhilarating. Not to use a tired phrase, but Panzer Dragoon is really all killer, no filler. There are 6 stages, plus the final boss, and after the initial 7-minute cutscene, there are only a few more minutes of cutscenes throughout the rest of the game. One could argue the final scene is a little too short, but it gets the job done. Team Andromeda opted for a more sparse, understated story, and I think it works well for this game. You can feel that there's a larger world of which you're just scratching the surface, and for me that was just really engrossing. And visually, this game was surprisingly impressive. Now, you can definitely tell that it came out almost 30 years ago, but those months of concept art did not go to waste, and Team Andromeda really pushed the Sega Saturn to its limits over the series' lifespan, and that started with this first game. So yes, it may be very polygonal, but I think the art style and the nature of the game's scenario actually play into the early 3D look very well. We're not focusing on human forms or faces much of the time, instead flying through the sky on a dragon with mysterious creatures and ships flanking us on all sides. It's alien enough that it's easier to look past the medium's growing pains, at least to me. And the music for this game can't go unmentioned. Yoshitaka Azuma uses a combination of orchestral themes and synthesized tunes for the soundtracks, and they all complement and accentuate the levels brilliantly. The song Flight from the first stage especially stands out and sets the tone for the game beautifully. So unlike the rest of the series, the original Panzer Dragoon has seen new light in the form of a remake. It released in 2020 and it had some pretty mixed reception. In a lot of ways, it's a very faithful remake. The levels are almost identically laid out, the gameplay is nearly the same, even the cutscenes replicate the feeling of the original, probably a little too much. However, there are about a million tiny things that people took issue with, as well as a few bigger things. Some of the bigger things include visual redesigns of some of the levels, the cutscene quality, and the difficulty. I would say overall the quality of the environment design is pretty uneven, and even the ones that are done pretty well lose some of the atmosphere from the original. The 4th stage was a highlight for me in the original, and they do a pretty good job with it in the remake, but they kinda overtuned the muzzle flashes in my opinion. And that's a common theme with the remake. They did this thing well, but it's a little undercut by this thing or that thing. As for the cutscenes, it seems they decided to be very faithful to the semi-awkward mid-90s animation and camera movements of the original. This really feels like a place to make some modernization adjustments, but ultimately that's just not the way they went. The difficulty situation is also kind of unfortunate. Like I said, the 1995 game is a serious challenge, and failure, at least failing enough times, means starting from the beginning. The remake offers difficulty levels. I played through on the normal difficulty and it was a relative cakewalk. I won't say I didn't die at all, but I think I died maybe once, and I was probably just being a little careless. So I went through a second time on hard mode and I still found it noticeably easier than the original. Now, I'm not someone who gets off on a game being difficult for its own sake, but part of the excitement of the original was the challenge. The sweaty palms, the raised heartbeats, the anticipation. Without that, you're kind of just floating through the game, blasting opponents. It loses some of the excitement. What I would have loved to see is a hard mode that reflects the difficulty of the original alongside the easier difficulties. I think having the option of an easier game is great, but I'd also like the option for a challenge, and as it is, this remake just don't got it. Now, some positives for the remake. It has nice transitions within the levels. Going into buildings or caves is much more seamless than the original. That's cool, neat addition. They also made a whole new soundtrack, which is switched off by default, interestingly, but the new music is pretty good. Also, you can control your cursor with the stick. This kind of contributes to the difficulty problem, but I like the concept. It's a mixed bag, but if you're wanting to dip your toe into the Panzer Dragoon franchise without having to deal with emulators, this remake is a decent enough representation of that first game. The dev team behind the remake did say immediately after its launch that they were working on the sequel, and while it's been said to still be in development, it's been a while since we've gotten any actual updates. I'm keeping my fingers crossed because all the issues in the first remake are very fixable, and Panzer Dragoon Zwei made a big impression on me. Zwei is a very iterative sequel, with the gameplay and structure of the game being similar in many ways to its predecessor. You fly through levels and you shoot enemies with a combination of gunfire and lasers. But it makes a few important and exciting changes, the biggest one being the ability to take multiple paths. Panzer Dragoon 1 played out along the exact same route every time, but the sequel has 3 stages with at least one branching path, and the 4th level even has 3 routes to take. This then plays into another change, which is your dragon's ability to change and evolve. Depending on how well you perform and which routes you take, you will earn points that cause your dragon, Logi, to evolve. This changes his physical appearance and even allows him to fire off more lasers at one time, so the game really rewards you for finding routes and getting good at taking down enemies. And if you earn all of the possible points, you'll even unlock a special ending along with a particularly special form for Logi. Earning all these points is no cakewalk, as the game still gives you a good challenge just like the first game. However, there is a new system put in place to make sure that anyone can at least have a better chance of clearing the campaign. Basically, after seeing the difficulty that people had finishing the first game, they decided to implement dynamic difficulty into Zwei. If you take out fewer enemies at a slower speed, the game will then spawn fewer of them and have them fire less often, and vice versa. Andromeda also got rid of the limited continues and gave the ability to save between stages. On top of all this, they added in Berserk mode. There's a gauge down in the lower left that fills up as you land hits on enemies, and when you have it at least partially filled, you can activate Berserk mode and Logi will fire off a bunch of lasers in rapid succession until the bar depletes. This looks and feels really nice, and it can get you out of some tight situations. Personally, I found this game to be even more enjoyable than the first, and really it's my favorite game in the series. It starts off a little suddenly, as your town is almost immediately blown up, and then the first level surprised me as it was much slower than its predecessor. The first game really just throws you in, whereas this one puts you down on the ground with much fewer enemies, allowing you to come to grips with the mechanics and take in the scenario. But things pick up in the second episode with the first branching path, lots of enemies, and our first boss. For all intents and purposes, episode 2 is the first proper stage, and it really feels like you're back in the saddle. And Zwei mostly carries this momentum through the rest of its runtime. There's great variety in all the levels, and the enemy placement and aggression really puts you on the edge of your seat a lot of the time. That, oh shit, what's coming next feeling came back in a big way throughout Zwei. And a big part of that is the bosses. Episodes 3, 4, and the final boss in particular were fantastic encounters that really stuck with me. And I just have to gush for a moment about Episode 4's environment. It's pretty reminiscent of Episode 4 from the previous game, which was also one I really enjoyed. You're once again flying through tunnels in various directions, flanked on all sides by drones, but this time there's a little more variety in the momentum. At certain points you'll travel along the floor, and other times you'll come to a stop. There's even one point where you ride up an elevator as these hulking creatures slowly come to life around you. Oh, and the water effect they used in this stage is just gorgeous, and it plays a huge role in the boss fight, which is also top-notch. I'm running out of positive synonyms to use for this stage, but basically, I really like it. All the other episodes are also very exciting and fun to blast through, with the outlier being Stage 5. It's kinda short and the boss is a bit of a head scratcher, but it still looks gorgeous and it's fun enough while you're playing through it. Panzer Dragoon Zwei is just fantastic, and if this video inspires other people to play it, I'm happy. So now we come to what is considered by many to be the magnum opus of the series, Panzer Dragoon Saga. A game that took the series in a totally new direction and had ambitions that were nearly unprecedented for RPGs at the time. We start once again with a fairly lengthy cutscene, over 10 minutes, setting up our new protagonist, edge, as well as establishing some world building and a mystery in the form of this girl encased in stone who gets stolen away by a hostile force. Our protagonist even gets killed and revived in this opening sequence. Andromeda were really going for it here. Anyway, you quickly come across a dragon who chooses you as his rider, and the two of you set off on your adventure to... well, your objective kind of changes over time, but you're off regardless. Throughout Saga, you'll be exploring various map zones on Dragonback in search of your objectives, with random enemy encounters and other puzzle-style obstacles along the way. And like any good RPG, there are also items to find and, of course, side quests to complete. You've got your wild zones with enemies, you've got your towns with merchants and other NPCs, and you've got a few dungeons as well. Pretty much all the stuff you'd expect from a classic JRPG, right down to the overworld map with multiple destinations to travel between. Now, before we go any further, I should make my opinion clear. I'm not really one for this style of RPG. And it's kind of hard for me to articulate why, but I'm just not into the pacing that they tend to have. And the genre, especially at the time, was known for a certain style of humor and overall narrative that just doesn't resonate with me. So with all that said, Panzer Dragoon Saga was kind of a low point for me in the series, purely based on the mold and the genre it was working from. My experience overall was positive, but there were certainly moments when my patience was tested. Let's start with the combat, which is something I actually quite enjoyed. It works similarly to the previous two games, but also quite differently. You're still riding on a dragon with the ability to fire your gun or have the dragon fire lasers, but Andromeda added several new abilities and mechanics to bring the action fully into the RPG genre. Your position in battle is now relegated to 4 zones centered around your enemy. You can circle around to their front, back, or either side. Many enemies will have red or green zones indicated on the minimap, which either pose a greater threat or allow you to find safety. There are some enemies who are invulnerable to either gunfire or lasers, forcing you to adapt your method of attack, and a lot of enemies will also have a weak spot if you get the right angle. And the battle system is very reminiscent of the ATB system, with slowly refilling gauges that determine when you can attack or use items. There are modifications you can get for your gun, which will let you do things like shooting 3 enemies at once or dealing increased damage to weak spots. The game also expands on the Berserk mode from Zwei, essentially turning it into your magic system, with some spells being dependent on your dragon's form. Speaking of which, the dragon's form is part of a very fluid system in which you can emphasize 1 or 2 of your dragon's traits to the detriment of the others. This menu will allow you to smoothly transition between any of these forms, affecting both the stats and the dragon's physical appearance in a really fluid way. It's pretty sick, actually. And while you can probably get through the game just sticking with one form of dragon, I actually found the game incentivized me pretty well through the various encounters and scenarios to change up my stats and take a new approach. The combat is quite cinematic too. The camera moves and frames the battle beautifully as you circle around the enemy, and many attacks get their own special brief cutscene. And something Andromeda did to inject some more action and speed into the combat is mapping the gun and dragon lasers to quick button presses. So instead of having to open the menu and select either of those attacks, you can just hit a button and do it. It's a really nice touch. Using all these mechanics along with clever enemy placement, tackling Saga's combat often feels very satisfying. Figuring out which dragon form or weapon mod to use, what position gives you the advantage, weighing the pros and cons of different strategies, it's really good stuff. There were a few times when a mechanic just wasn't clicking for me, making the game a bit frustrating, and there were definitely some combat encounters that were less than inspired, especially when you just end up fighting the same enemies dozens of times in a row, and I really think this issue is worsened in the latter half of the game. Let's just say I was not generally a fan of the game's dungeons. Places like the Uru Underground and the Tower just feel overly drawn out with repetitive, winding corridors and a very small assortment of repeated combat encounters. There are some interesting narrative moments within, and there's definitely a version of these areas that could have been more interesting, but as it is, they're mostly tedious to get through. And hey, speaking of tedium, why don't we talk about the other major component of the game, the settlements. From villages to camps to secret bases, there are a good handful of places to stretch your legs between battles. I should point out that this game is very hands-off with its directions. After the tutorial area, the game just kind of opens up a world map and says, well, nothing. It says nothing. There's not really an indication of what your exact goal is or where you might achieve it. It's all context-based. If a new spot opens up on your map, you go there. If there are no new areas, you have to decide where to go based on what was said in dialogue and cutscenes beforehand. And sometimes I think even that won't really help you decide where to go. Listen, I'm an idiot. Just give me a waypoint that I can follow so I don't have to think about where to go. I'm kidding. Kind of. But some kind of hint would have really been appreciated. I'll give you an example. After going to this place called the Forbidden Zone to track down your target, Kramen, you find that he's slipped away and probably gone to the tower, the location of which you do not know. Then you have a boss battle where no more information is given, you change discs, and then you're just back on the map. At this point I decided to revisit the caravan because there are people there. Maybe they can provide some guidance. I ended up talking to this random, possibly nameless NPC who says, "We're heading to a forest to the east. There is a town near that forest." This then unlocks the village of Zoa, which has a bunch of people you can talk to. So I go around town talking to absolutely everyone, and because this game has an early version of a day-night cycle, I do this twice. I seemingly exhaust all of my options and start heading back to other places I've been before, praying that I blindly stumble upon the plot. Eventually, I decided to look up the solution online, and it turned out I didn't talk to this inconspicuous barkeep enough, and I needed to have a drink to make any headway. This just seems random as hell. The bartender tells you about Pate. This guy, who I tried to talk to while I was wandering around, but the game hadn't decided it was time for me to talk to him yet, so Edge just kind of shrugged his shoulders when I tried to interact with the guy. Maybe all this makes more sense for those who have played more RPGs like this, but I just found it to be incredibly frustrating. And while this was the worst example, it certainly wasn't the only one. I think even just implementing something like a one-sentence hint in the pause menu would have made a big difference. Something else that was kind of a letdown was the game's language. The previous two games used a fictional language for the voiceover that's been dubbed Panzerese. It had the dual benefit of adding another layer of mystique to the world and eliminating the need for localization from Japanese to English. The Panzerese language makes an appearance or two in Saga, but 99% of the dialogue in this game is just spoken in Japanese. Now, I don't speak Japanese to any degree, but I've heard enough of it over the years that it's become kind of familiar to me, much more than Panzerese for sure. So the world of Saga lost some of its mystique to me. Aside from that, this change led to a different problem. The subtitles in this game are really inconsistent, specifically in how long they're on screen. There were times where I legitimately missed some dialogue because it just went by way too fast. I assume this was because A, Andromeda only had one line of text on screen at a time, and B, they were trying to match the timing of the Japanese voice acting. And so anytime there was dialogue, I had to glue my eyes to the bottom of the screen because any text that popped up could potentially be gone in a quarter of a second. And given how much this game expects you to pay attention to the dialogue to know what's going on and where to go, it really would have been nice if it weren't so easy to miss some of it. When it comes to the narrative, I think for its time, relative to what else was coming out, it was pretty impressive. That said, I wasn't amazed by it. I was intrigued in the beginning, particularly with the mystery of this Azel character. She's got a very unique visual design, and she's made out to be very important, since she gets stolen by Kramen in the opening cutscene. Then she reappears later, riding atop this huge dragon, proving to be a very intimidating boss. After you encounter her a couple times though, she basically loses the dragon and becomes a helper/damsel, and just becomes a much less interesting character. She's got the whole machine learning to become human arc going, but I feel like they could have done much more to explore that transformation. Edge also doesn't do much to set himself apart as a protagonist. His motivation for a large part of the game is just basic revenge for the death of his friends, later on changing to saving the world. Now, there are some interesting wrinkles in the plot and they threw some twists in there, but overall the story didn't leave as big an impression on me as I had anticipated. This game is hailed as a masterpiece, with the narrative playing no small part in that praise. And as often as the term masterpiece is kind of thrown around by gamers, this game is well respected by a lot of people, which makes me wish I could feel the same way, but I just don't, at least not as far as the plot goes. However, the ending of this game is really a stroke of genius. Spoilers ahead, obviously. After saying his goodbyes to Ozzel, Edge transports into the Zestran network, a mysterious place that holds the secret to stopping the cycle of destruction that started long ago. He faces multiple shadow versions of his dragon, ultimately then facing Zestran itself. After this, your dragon takes on an angelic form and beckons you to destroy it. And when I say you, I mean you. The dragon speaks to the player, who has been guiding and inhabiting the main character throughout the game, and indeed throughout the previous games as well. Edge himself even looks through the screen in shock and acknowledges your existence as the divine visitor that's been spoken of throughout his journey. Not only is this a hell of a surprise twist, but it actually makes you think about the whole series up to this point in a whole new light, and it really ties everything together. In fact, one thing that's quite nice about this game overall is how well it addresses a lot of the questions and mysteries presented in the first two games. The developers gave a lot of answers without demystifying the world, which I really appreciate. And the music is really solid, once again. That's one of the constants through these first three games. They've all got banging soundtracks. I may not have enjoyed my time with Panzer Dragoon Saga as much as I'd hoped, but I do still think it's worth playing because the combat is very clever a lot of the time and the ending is truly special. And the plot along the way can be enjoyable at times as well. This marks the end of Team Andromeda, unfortunately, but there is still one Panzer Dragoon game remaining. Much of the staff from Andromeda went on to form a studio called Smilebit, and among other things they developed what is currently the last Panzer Dragoon game, Orta. This game released on the original Xbox, giving it a nice bump in graphical fidelity and better audio capabilities. Plus, it's the first time a Panzer Dragoon game was able to make use of an analog stick. So the story is sort of a continuation of the previous games, but it's also kind of a reboot, and it kind of contradicts some of the plot elements, or at least makes things muddier. Saga seemed to wrap things up pretty nicely, and it would have been nice to see Orta take things in a bit of a different direction. That said, it's not that bad. It's pretty engaging while it's unfolding, for the most part. There is quite a bit of screen time dedicated to these friendly NPCs turned enemies, turned friends, turned comrades who later swoop into an alternate dimension somehow to save the day in an awkward silence. But aside from that, the game does have some interesting moments and mysteries. There's even a surprise reveal about halfway through, but unfortunately it doesn't really amount to much. Kind of a missed opportunity. But arguably more important than all that is how the game plays. I would say Orta feels like a natural evolution of the Panzer Dragoon formula from a gameplay perspective. The game introduces some new mechanics on top of the ones already introduced in the prior sequels. As usual, you can fire your gun or lock on to fire multiple homing lasers, but now, much like in Saga, you can change your dragon's form at will, but now under more pressure due to the faster-paced nature of this game compared to the turn-based Saga. There are three forms that you can cycle through: normal, heavy, and light. The normal wing is what you've come to expect from the series, standard gun and laser. The heavy wing is similar, but with fewer projectiles that fly slower, as well as a larger frame and less mobility. The light wing has much greater mobility, but no laser function. Instead, holding down the fire button fires a continuous volley of gunfire. The reticle also encompasses a wide area, and the gunfire will auto-target anything within its reticle, making the light wing really good for dispatching incoming projectiles or large numbers of weak enemies. Each wing also has its own berserk attack. The normal wing has the classic berserk move from Zwei, while the Heavy Berserk is a more targeted beam. Interestingly, the Lightwing's Berserk move actually replenishes some of your health. It's not a lot, but every little bit helps. And this is the first time a traditional Panzer Dragoon game has implemented any way to replenish your health in the middle of a stage. But you'd be forgiven for not noticing that this move replenishes your health. The gauge fills up pretty quickly and it happens the instant you hit the button. And since it's such a small amount, you may not even notice the difference with everything else that's going on, because there's still more that I haven't gotten to, like the ability to boost or slow down your dragon. There's now a button that will propel your dragon forward and one that slows them down momentarily. It's not obvious at first what function this serves, but eventually it becomes clear. That is, if you remember this function, because it doesn't really come into play until halfway through the second level. When you're fending off this pair of giant worms, they'll occasionally do this move where they physically approach and ram into your dragon. Boosting forward will get you out of range of the attack, but at this point I had completely forgotten about this mechanic and just kept getting hit by it. The game never introduces this mechanic, or indeed any mechanic. Despite Orta being more mechanically complex than the previous entries and being on an entirely new platform, they still opted to be 100% hands-off and leave everything up to the player to figure out how the game works. The game later revisits another mechanic introduced by Saga with battle positioning. In some scenarios, particularly boss battles, you can change your relative position to your enemy by boosting or slowing down your dragon. There's a gauge for boosting that has different quantities and recharges faster depending on your dragon's form, with the heavy form not being able to boost or slow down at all. Got all that memorized? Because this is all stuff you have to juggle in your brain while dispatching enemies in this game. This game is exceedingly hard at times, even on normal difficulty. And it does have difficulty selection, thankfully, so if you just can't deal with the normal difficulty anymore, you can bump it down to easy. I did try the easy difficulty, and it was much more manageable. It was actually kind of overly easy at times, especially using the Lightwing. But I was also already familiar with all the game's tricks, so I had an advantage there. One of the frustrating elements of the difficulty was just the amount of health the bosses have. In the first two Panzer Dragoons, once you got good at taking down a boss, you could dispatch them in 1 or 2 minutes. In Orta, almost all bosses take at least 3 minutes, for me, after already having completed the game, and many take somewhere from 4 to 6 minutes, with a couple taking 7 or 8. And when you're fighting a boss that's really putting the pressure on, a minute can be a long time. The boss fights just feel way too long, and dying feels like a serious drag. But Smilebit did at least do us the courtesy of allowing us to respawn at the beginning of the boss battle, which I do appreciate. Another issue with the game overall is how disorienting it can be. The previous games had their moments where the speed would ramp up and you'd be whipping around in various directions, but those moments were kind of few and far between. But in this game, I found myself frequently getting whiplash from my dragon twisting, flipping, and turning at max speed in some of the levels. It was just another layer of disorientation on top of all the mechanics I had to juggle. This is a lot of complaining, but honestly the core of the gameplay is pretty solid, and there is something to be enjoyed here. It's just a lot to deal with, and I found myself grimacing in frustration a little too often. On the bright side, I got really good at the previous games, and I know this because Orta actually has a playable version of the original Panzer Dragoon in it. So I gave it a try and I beat it in one go. I died a couple times, but I beat it. When I first played the game, I thought beating the final boss without save states would be insanely challenging, but after Orta, it wasn't that bad. Overall, I respect Smilebit for what they attempted with this game, but I don't know if it's one I'd revisit. There are just too many things holding it back from being great. But if you play through the other Panzer Dragoon games, I would say this one is worth playing at least once. There is one other chapter in the Panzer Dragoon story, though unfortunately, it's a disappointing one. In 2013, Panzer Dragoon's original director, Yukio Futetsugi, partnered with several key members from the original Team Andromeda to produce a spiritual successor to their seminal series. This game, Crimson Dragon, would be one of a tiny handful of exclusive titles for the Xbox One. It actually began as a Kinect-only title on the 360, before eventually pivoting to more traditional controls and shifting to the Xbox One. And Crimson Dragon, well, frankly, it kinda sucks. And I hate to say that, but the game doesn't do much to win you over. One of the first things you'll notice upon booting up the game is the microtransactions they've implemented, front and center. They take the form of nondescript gems, uninspired even by microtransaction standards. Then, once you start the game, you're greeted with narration played over what is essentially a concept art slideshow with a bit of animation. This is what a majority of the cutscenes look like. And the substance of the dialogue isn't much to write home about either. Pretty cliche, dull, and sort of nonsensical. Outside of the cutscenes, you're left to navigate a bunch of menus with mission selection, a shop to buy things, including the microtransactions, a menu for your dragon with a bunch of its own sub-menus, and an inventory menu, not to mention the multiplayer menu. So you use mission select to decide where you're going next, but unfortunately this game reuses the same 5 or so maps for the majority of its playtime. The routes you take through the maps are a little different, but everything will become very familiar very quickly. All of this leaves the game feeling very cheap. I mean, this background on the menu screen feels like it's straight out of 2002. Then there's a bunch of baffling decisions like putting timers on boss encounters, after which you kind of just move on regardless of your performance, or having 3 slightly large bugs as the boss fight for one of the levels, or overcomplicating the control scheme they had perfected in Panzer Dragoon, or selling items that just let you continue playing after dying. Actually, I guess that last one's not as baffling. I can at least tell why they would sell such a thing. The visuals and the music really didn't do much for me either. Some of the designs are occasionally interesting, but the way they're rendered just doesn't do them any favors, in my opinion. Overall, I can hardly describe this game as much more than a dud. A dud. It feels like it doesn't have any soul or ambition. I played through some of the other titles produced by these developers, like Gun Valkyrie and Phantom Dust, and for all the issues they had, there was something interesting about them. Some kind of spark, and I can't say the same for Crimson Dragon. Fortunately, this was not the end. We have the Panzer Dragoon remake now, and while the news on the sequel's remake has been a little dubious, there have been rumors that Sega's big push for new games / remakes / whatever it is they're doing with these properties is going to include Panzer Dragoon. Considering how confident the remake developers were about the progress of Zwei's remake, it makes sense to me that this would be more of a strategic delay than an issue with development. At least that's what the copium tells me. The Panzer Dragoon series is truly something special. Even if I had some issues with Saga and Orta, they both still have great qualities to them, and the first 2 games are truly excellent experiences. It would genuinely be a tragedy for this series to be lost to time, so I'm thankful that we at least have emulators for the time being to keep these games alive. It would be amazing if we could get some sort of port for the original games, particularly Zwei and Saga, as there really is no way to play them without a Saturn or an emulator. For now, we can only cross our fingers and hope. But if you haven't played any of these games, I would strongly recommend any and all of them. The remake is available on all modern platforms, and I think it's a decent jumping off point. And as I mentioned, Orta and the original can be played through backwards compatibility on Xbox. If you want to play all the games and you're unsure on how to get started, I'll be putting a link up on screen to a video on how to do just that, because I want it to be as easy as possible for people to get into these games. I also want to give a quick shout out to I Finished a Video Game. His video on the Panzer Dragoon series is what prompted me to give these games a try, and I would highly recommend watching his video. It's very thorough and entertaining. But thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do me the kindness of liking the video and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more. And if you could share the video with a friend, that would also help out a lot. And if you've got a couple bucks to spare, maybe you can check out my Patreon too. Thank you again, and I'll catch you in the next one.